Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of our mammoth marathon El Alamein fortnight. And I want to just start by saying, although Alamein is the catch-all title, we're talking about the war in the Mediterranean. We're talking about tactical air power from 1941 onwards. And today we're starting the story a little bit earlier in the North African campaign. And it's the only one of this series that's really concerned with intelligence specifically, and agents and spying and code breaking and ciphers and intercepts and things like that. So I'm really excited to bring you today's show. So Phil Craig is a renowned TV producer, writer. His book on the Battle of Britain is one of my absolute favorites. I'm delighted that Phil is joining me. So good evening, Phil.
Hello, and good evening to you. Thank you very much for having me on board.
Well, thank you. And you're one of those people that came to me with an idea, which is it saves a lot of legwork for me contacting people, asking them to do stuff. So you came with the idea fully fledged, really. So, you know, the thing about intelligence war and code breaking is there's so much kind of legend around it and mystique. And as soon as the word agent or spy comes in, people start making the James Bond comparisons, and people start saying how much of this is real and how much of this is exaggerated. So, if in your investigation of something like the Battle of Britain, where there's exaggerations of claims, it's one set of problems to deal with. But in investigating an agent and all that, how difficult was it pulling this story together and working out?
This is probably why I came to you, Paul. So I've been badgering people to tell this story in documentaries, in movies. I think you could make a great feature film out of it. Because the beauty of this story is the central character is a man called Bonner Fellers. I think we might have a picture of him somewhere. We can bring him up, the star of the show. And what's incredible about this story is that it's not really a spy story at all. Bonner Fellers is, I call him the accidental agent, because he never knew while he was being an agent, or indeed for the rest of his life, what he had actually done. And the reason he never knew is that it was such an incredibly secret and important story that it was covered up remarkably effectively. I think it's the greatest unknown spy story, or I should say intelligence story, of World War II. I mean, it's not unknown, it's in academic textbooks, but it's little known. And it's incredibly interesting because of what he does, which we'll get into, but also it tells you so much about the American-British relationship at a really hinge moment. And it tells us an awful lot about how the Desert War was fought on both the British and the German side. And I think also most fascinatingly, perhaps, it tells us a lot about Rommel, this famous general who is seen as being, one of the greatest tactical generals of all time, and no doubt he is. But learning a little bit about Fellers makes you wonder whether Rommel's reputation was completely deserved. Perhaps there were a few other things going on that most people don't know about.
Well, indeed, and in the show last night with Cedric Mass, Rommel and Montgomery both came up, and their doctrine, their art of war that has been much discussed and debated over the last 80 years. But of course, first and foremost, to both their abilities to wage war, although we're talking about pre Montgomery mostly tonight, is intelligence about what the enemy are doing. In order to formulate your own plan, you want to know what the enemy are doing, so you can counteract what they're doing. And that the intelligence war was really exciting out in North Africa, especially because of all that kind of intrigue and languages and cultures and the different places that these things happened all across North Africa and Cairo and places, and that's why it's rife for movies, isn't it? You've only got to look at movies like Casablanca that are set in that kind of area of intrigue and romance and daring do. But where should we start? I'll hand it over to you to kind of start with the story. And folks, we'll kind of do questions as we go along. There's a few little film clips we've got. So before we start, just explain about the little film clips we're going to be using and where they came from.
Sure. Well, as well as writing this book, which I shall now wave in the general direction of your audience, I wrote this book a few years ago. It's the second in a volume, a trilogy. And you mentioned very generously the first one about the Battle of Britain. This was written about 1942. And I'm currently working on the final one, 20 years later, about 1945. So I've written the book, and I also made a 2-hour TV series, all about, mostly about the desert campaign itself, but we did include some material on Fellers, and I've got a few clips of that which we can look at in a minute. So look, the quick intro is, this is a story of a man who unwittingly almost lost North Africa and the Mediterranean for the Allies. And he did it at a time long before Stalingrad, when the Germans are still really very much on the front foot, coming down in the Caucasus, where Operation Case Blue is going on rather successfully. They're sweeping forward in North Africa. There's a real danger that they can seize oil fields in the Middle East, drive the British out of Cairo and Alexandria, the great imperial bases. And all of this is happening when the British and the Americans are sort of maneuvering around each other. They're not quite sure about overall strategy. There are big rows going on about how the war should be prosecuted. And they're not quite sure, really, on the American side, whether the British, frankly, deserve the sort of help that the British are asking for. So in the middle of all this, Bonnefellers emerges. Now, he comes to Cairo as the US military attaché, and that's in 1940. And I should say, you know, we're all so used, aren't we, to the stories of the great friendship that developed and did develop between Churchill and Roosevelt, and the wonderful alliance that finally emerges between the British and the Americans. But, you know, at the beginning, certainly in 1940, it was not a given. It was by no means a given that the Americans were going to throw their lot in with Britain. The people around Roosevelt and Roosevelt himself, they came to this relationship with an awful lot of suspicion. Most of them had been on the American left. They campaigned against the British Empire, both in terms of the morality of the empire, but also its effect on international trade. They blamed the British Empire to a large degree for some of the terrible economic problems that people had in the 30s. So they didn't quite yet understand how dreadful Hitler was, but they did know an awful lot about how terrible the British Empire was in their view. So it was not a given that they would give us the help we wanted. And many people have made many programs and written many books about the very slow wooing of FDR. And the Battle of Britain, of course, is a big part of that. They come to see the British as heroic and standing up for decent values, and they become much more friendly to the British. But at the beginning, they were not. And so Fellers arrives at the beginning of that process. And it's really important to the people in Cairo that Fellers is made to feel welcome. And this is the start of everything that kind of goes wrong, because they make him so very, very welcome that over the 2.5 years that he's there, 2 years, he becomes almost part of the family in this weirdly dysfunctional soap opera of British high command in Cairo and Alexandria, with the cocktail parties and the affairs and the backbiting. And you know the story of all the generals, how they're falling out with each other, left, right, and center. He becomes enmeshed in that world, and he learns everything. And unfortunately, he starts communicating everything back to Washington, which was his job, but he does it in a really old-fashioned, naive, and foolish way. And nobody stops him, and nobody thinks that anybody else might be listening. So this is a story in some senses of naivety and trying to be too nice to people who you want to be an ally with.
Well, shall we do that first little clip? And apparently I had a bit of audio echo on my end. I've played around with my settings. Folks, tell me if I'm still echoing. But let's do that first little clip about kind of Fellers' arrival in North Africa. So we'll play that, folks. And it's just amazing, Phil, isn't it, that in this situation, you said yourself that the British are so desperate to court the Americans. Are they avoiding security protocol, or are they just not thinking about it?
Well, they did think about it, and I've got a few documents actually. We could look at them, I think, on the PowerPoint. There's a lot of an exchange. This is when I'll jump forward now to 41. So America isn't in the war yet, but it has made this big decision to help Britain. That starts in 1940, and it's ramped up a lot with Lend-Lease and with the Atlantic Charter. So they're very much on side economically, which makes it even more important, I guess, that Fellers says to Washington, the place you need to be sending weapons is here, because they really need it, and they're worth it. They might win. It'll be good for us to help the British in Africa. And as I said, there was this suspicion always about British imperialism. Do the British want this stuff to help beat the Nazis, or do the British want this stuff to prop up a regime that we're all a little bit worried about, we don't really like? I mean, that dynamic plays out right through the war, by the way. But anyway, yes, so it's 41. and they're trying to work out protocols. And if you look at the quote, that's from the book. These are all from a document from mid sort of spring and summer of 41. It's essential not to give the impression that information to which he's entitled is being withheld, including the most secret information on any subject connected with the war effort. Now, not everybody in London is comfortable about this. And there's a bit of a back and forth about, well, do you know what? He should have this, but he shouldn't have that. And then somebody else says, nothing, the leakage of which might have serious consequences. And those words are going to come back to haunt them, believe me. Mm. It turns out, because he was so thoroughly embedded, kind of socially as well as operationally, that people were sort of forgetting to make the distinction. If you look on the next clip, I think they talk at the next document on the PowerPoint, they try to make a distinction between, yes, you can talk to him about tactics, you can talk to him about what's happening on the battlefield, you can talk to him about how the equipment's working, especially the American stuff, because it's really important for him to know that, since we want more of it and we'd like it to be perfected, of course. And indeed, the Americans were desperate for information about a modern war because they thought, well, we might be in one soon. Mm. But all the time, he's not meant to know future plans. But can you imagine being in a staff conference in the middle of some of these operations, say in 41, where people are they're looking after the battle axe campaign, shall we say? Is he meant to leave the room when they talk about how they're going to react to this latest thing that Rommel's done? Is he meant to cover his ears? It was incredibly vague, and it was like an accident waiting to happen. In fact, there's even a bit of, I don't know if I put it up here, but there's even a document that says we should monitor his communications with Washington, and somebody recommends he uses the British secret encrypted system, so he could send it to the British embassy, and somebody says, "Oh no, that's incredibly rude to somebody we want to be an ally. Surely we can trust them to look after the communications." Well, turns out they really couldn't. And that was a really big problem. I should also say at this point, Fellers isn't just a military attaché. Nobody in the British knows this. He's an OSS operative as well. So it's like he's in the army, but he's also a spy. And he's kind of spying on us. And the OSS is the organization that kind of turns in the fullness of time into the CIA. It's run by this guy, Wild Bill Donovan, a very important figure in America at that time and right through into the 50s. And everything Fellers writes goes to Donovan. It goes directly to Roosevelt. It goes to the chiefs of staff. I mean, there is no more sensitive kind of diplomatic military posting in the world than this guy in Cairo in 41. And then guess what? War breaks out. And then suddenly, we're allies with the Americans, and the whole relationship moves to a different level. And there's a new problem, and that is, what is the priority for the war? And if you've read Alan Brooke, and I'm sure you have, there's a long-running debate about the Americans. First of all, they want to prioritize the Pacific. They want to deal with Europe later, and so we can't do that. We need to do something. Look, Stalin's screaming for help. Then they have this crazy idea. We need a second front in 1942. We need to flood Britain with troops, which is very hard because the U-boats are still really active. Flood Britain with troops, launch a second front. Churchill and Alan Brooke are like, no way, that's crazy. You don't know, A, you don't know how good the Germans are. We do. B, your own army is like, they're just trainees. Let's do this slowly and cleverly. Let's come through the Mediterranean. Let's drive them out of Africa and maybe come up through Italy. And the Americans are like, well, it's the British Empire again, isn't it? Why don't we just go for France? Gung ho. And this is such a big issue. And of course, Fellers is at the heart of it. He's sending communications back and forward to all his mates, and they are the most important men in Washington. And he eventually is persuaded by the British that it's a good idea to send lots and lots of help to the desert. And also that the Germans are really, really good. And it might be a good idea to fight them there first, rather than launching this very dangerous, scary invasion of France straight away. So it's kind of great that Fellers is given all this access. But in the short term, everything then spins out of control. Because we're now jumping to the end of 41. The Italians don't get a great rep in military history. I think it's rather unfair, actually.
I agree. Yeah,
they do some amazing things. Certainly in some parts of the Desert War and some naval actions. But one thing the Italians do is very relevant to fellas. Just before Pearl Harbor, I think it's October or September 41, they break in to the American embassy in Rome, open the safe, take out the code books, copy them, replace them, close the safe, leave the building. Nobody knows they've been there. And this is really, really important. They now can read American diplomatic traffic. And they share this, of course, with the Germans. The Americans are new to war. I mean, they've got bigger things on their minds. Pearl Harbor's just happened. They don't really get round to refreshing all of their kind of secret communications. So they're using this code going into 42. Fellers is using it in 42. And that's when things start going really, really badly wrong, because he is sending incredibly detailed accounts of what the British are up to, and it's going straight to the Germans. And there's some really good quotes about that. Some historians argue that this was only one of Rommel's advantages, because he had others. He had some really good cipher people in his own units listening into what the British and the Indians and the Australians were doing. But if you look at the German sources, it's all fellas. I mean, they just can't get enough of it. It's a quote from, I think it's a quote from Hitler himself. So I don't know if I've got it written down here. I think I probably do.
Is it on the slide?
No, it's not on there actually. I'll get.
No.
Well, this is from Hitler later in the story actually. So I'll get to Hitler in a minute. Because there's this, you know, the story leading up to Alamein. There is the battles at Gazala, the battle in the Cauldron, the fall of Tobruk. Now this is the high point of Feller's intel. They're getting twice daily accounts. It's coming to Rommel almost as quick as it's coming to Washington. And they wait for it. Rommel's own staff officers, after the war, wrote about this. They wait every day for what they call the good source, the gute Quelle. This good source is Feller's, because he doesn't know he's the good source, but he is. And if you look at the story of those campaigns, the British generals, I mean, they sort of slightly hero worship Rommel anyway, even though he's the enemy, because he's a genius and his men have got great equipment and great morale. But he has this uncanny ability to strike at their weak points, avoid their strong points, and anticipate their every move. Why is that? One of the reasons is Fellers is sending these remarkably detailed accounts of how the British are doing, which division is short of petrol, which division has just lost, its most senior officers, which division's got really bad morale. Very, very detailed daily accounts of what the British generals are trying to do to hold him back. And that is an enormous advantage to any general. I think the next clip might deal with this, actually.
Yeah, so let's just recap for a second. So Fellers he's there as an advisor, but he's also there for the OSS as a spy. He's there to liaise. He's there he's been invited there by the British. This is before the Americans were in the war. And then he is using his method of sending messages that the Italians have already managed how to intercept, because they broke into the office and worked out
that's right.
Code. So he's there to get information. He's there to smooth the relationship between the Allies. But what he's actually doing, as you said yourself, inadvertently, is he's becoming a leak for red hot data and intel straight to Rommel.
And I actually have a personal story about this. A wonderful old soldier, Peter Vaux, who was in all of my books and was actually the last surviving staff officer from Alamein. Peter knew Fellers. Peter was the intelligence officer for 7th Armored, a very, very important unit in the story of the Desert War. And he was absolutely at the heart of what they were doing. Fellers was a very popular man. He was very garrulous. He was good fun. He would turn up, and he had absolute carte blanche to drive around the British bases with a bottle of whiskey. And they would sit with Peter looking at the stars and others and talk about what was going on. And had an amazing memory. And Peter said, he never knew at the time he might have been giving information that ended up on Rommel's desk the next morning.
Right. So we've got the Ray Ellis clip, and we've got the one about Rommel's information. Which one shall I play next?
Oh, I don't know. I should say I made this show 12 years ago. The quality of the dramatic reconstructions is a little bit amateur dramatic. I could do it better now, but it's a good story. Play them both.
Let's do the Ray Ellis one. Okay.
Father. Rommel had this unique ability to foresee British operations and strategy in North Africa. He controlled that theatre. Well,
let's explain who Ray is first, I think.
Well, Ray is a wonderful old soldier who served, and was actually eventually captured during these battles leading up to Alamein. Artilleryman, he'd survived the first siege of Tobruk, which was the great glory story of 41, which becomes the great disaster story of 42, partly, I think, because of Fellers. So he's a wonderful guy, and he gave me the most incredible interview about what it was like to be a soldier on the front line of that campaign. And I think he might feature in James Holland's recent book, I think. Was it James's book? About the artillerymen in North Africa. Maybe it wasn't James. Somebody else.
Peter Hart, maybe?
Peter Hart, of course. Peter's book, yes. And he's just one of those great characters that also lived to a great old age and was still very, very articulate. So he was a dream for people like us.
So Rommel's getting this information because the Italians have worked out how to intercept the American transmissions. But at this point, let's make it clear: the British do not know the information is leaking yet. They have no reason to believe anything is untoward, and the Germans are getting this information. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. I found that one of those German quotes I was looking for before. This is from one of Rommel's intelligence aides. He recalled, "Every day at lunch, we knew exactly where the Allied troops were standing the night before," which is an amazing quote, isn't it?
Wow.
And as I mentioned, at the time, the Germans are still really on the front foot. They are in Russia, they are in the desert, and the U-boat campaign is still very much a live threat as well. So a total collapse of the British position in North Africa wouldn't only, give the Germans a massive victory and the access to all these oil fields that they're desperate for, it would really shake this new alliance with Washington. And Stalin wouldn't have been too pleased either, because he was always of the opinion the British didn't really want to fight until all the Russians were dead. So there's a lot at stake. And then, as you know, the Battle of Gazala is a decisive German victory. There's a mad retreat back hundreds of miles towards Alamein, and a real fear that Cairo will fall, the great imperial capital, and Alexandria, the massively important naval base that gives the British a toehold, more than a toehold, in the Mediterranean, could fall. And there's this famous story of this day, they call it Ash Wednesday, when there's just burning documents in the courtyards of all the British bases, and there's just clouds of ash going up. There are stories of the Arab shopkeepers putting up pictures of Hitler, waiting for the arrival of the German army. And this, I did find my Hitler quote, actually. This is from Hitler's own diary, or not his own diary. Is it called the Table Talk, isn't it? They wrote down things that he said. And just before the high point of this campaign by Rommel, he says, "The capture of Alexandria will infuriate the entire English people, because only the rich were interested in the fall of Singapore. I think it'll make them rise against Churchill in a coup. I only have one hope, that the famous American minister," he means Fellers, "in Cairo continues to inform us so well about the English plans through his cables." So Hitler knew all about it and was very excited about it. And yeah, that is a situation. Things are looking really bad. The generals are all at each other's throats. Churchill is about to fly out to fire them all. They're trying to scramble together a defense of Alamein, the first Battle of Alamein, which strategically was in some senses the most important, because it finally stops Rommel. He never goes any further. And it's at this point that the fella's story begins to unravel. I should also mention the jeopardy in politics. Churchill is facing a vote of no confidence because, as Hitler just mentioned, Singapore has fallen. There's all sorts of disasters happening in Burma and Malaya. Battleships have been sunk by the Japanese. There's this sense that we can't do anything right. And now we're losing even the famously brave stand at Tobruk. That's all forgotten. We just lost Tobruk. Rommel's on the march. He's facing criticism in Parliament. There's a vote. I think 25 people vote against him, but 100 abstain. Which, I mean, he's on notice. Another massive disaster. Churchill is out. It was that serious. In the middle of this, step forward the heroes of the story, which are the nameless codebreakers of Bletchley Park. I say nameless because so many things to do with the fellow's story are still classified today. My colleague, my friend Chris Jenner, you just saw him in the clip. He's worked really hard to get material out. He got some material out in 2014 and some before. But there's still a lot of this stuff that is very, very secret. You can't see it. What happens is we are reading the German communications. Bletchley Park is coming into its own now. It's the middle of 42. We're reading a lot of what the Germans are sending to each other. And they start to see references to things that the Germans really shouldn't know. The famous one is this German airbase. And the Germans are saying, oh my God, we realize the British are aware of the location of this base, and please rush air defenses because we think they might attack us. And the British codebreakers and analysts are like, hang on a minute, how do the Germans know what we know? And there are several of these, and the suspicion begins to mount that there is a spy in Cairo. And then it gets worse. There are these convoys. Malta, as you know, is a key to the Mediterranean campaign. Malta is being starved. It's very hard to get supplies there. There are a couple of convoys, one that's called Operation Harpoon, I think. And that is mentioned by Fellers in one of his cables, as is the commando raids that are meant to suppress the attacks on it. They're going to hit the air bases so they can't hit the British convoy. And it's a disaster. The Germans are waiting. The Italians are waiting. The convoy is savaged. There's obviously been another leak. And everybody's obsessed about what is happening in Cairo. And they devote an awful lot of attention. It goes all the way to Churchill. He's very anxious. Who is this spy? And then it gets kind of clever because they sort of think, well, hang on a second. It's not really. Some of these documents are strange. They intercept these very long accounts of the British tank movements and the reliability of British tanks. And the person writing this is comparing them to American tanks. And some clever person says, why would a spy, A, send such a very long message, because it's exposing him, but why would a spy be so interested in comparing what the British do to what America does? And then suddenly the penny does drop. It's not a spy. It's somebody in the American embassy. And very quickly, although it still takes about 2 weeks, to be honest, during which time Rommel is still getting messages. But very quickly, they work out it is this code book, and it is Fellers. And it happens at a perfect time politically for Churchill. He's actually in America when it all goes down. He's had to face this shocking news of the fall of Tobruk. There's this famous scene with Roosevelt where Roosevelt puts his arm around him and immediately promises to send lots and lots of material, some of which is already on its way to American units. He diverts it to Churchill. Churchill says, defeat is one thing, disgrace is another. He feels disgrace. After everything else that's gone wrong, he thinks this might be it for him and for Britain. Certainly for him. Then he hears that they worked out it's the Americans' fault. Well, he learns about Fellers, and he gets to personally explain this to Roosevelt. So suddenly he has a little bit of leverage. He's like, well, you guys sort of have not really been helpful here, have you? And that is a pivot point in the relationship both between British and American intelligence, because basically they stop spying on each other, mostly, and they really do start to forge a very good alliance from that point on. It's also a turning point in the grand strategy of the war, because after that meeting, Britain kind of gets its way. They do rush an awful lot of weaponry, and that's the weaponry that in a few months' time that will win at Alamein. Not troops, but equipment. And they basically accede to the Churchill-Allenbrook vision: Mediterranean first, Europe second. So it's one of those great moments. Everything comes together during these dramatic few days while he's in Washington, and I think also at Hyde Park with Roosevelt. And it's immediately apparent on the battlefield. I think the next clip, might talk about that. Suddenly, Rommel isn't getting the information, and that is not so good for him.
Yeah, I think it's the London Intercepts one, isn't it? Let me do that one. I'm getting myself
Overexcited.
Yeah, no, I'm enthralled. I'm listening, and I've got myself confused with clips. It's the one with here we go.
Is it 5 or is it 4? I'll play them both.
London intercepts.
That was the one just recapping what you said.
That was the Operation Harpoon story, which I think is the last really bad thing that he kind of does. And then they very quickly turn off the tap. They change the codes. They professionalize the whole operation. And then poor old Rommel hasn't got a good source anymore.
And I'll do the
I do apologize for the acting in that clip.
Yeah, it's fine. It's my hosting. And anyway, so this is where it's starting to lead up to what we're talking about over these 2 weeks, which is the Battle of Alamein. But of course, there's the events happening before. There's the first battle. There's the second battle. There's events after. So is that summer through to the autumn in 1942?
Basically he stops getting the help. If you go to the PowerPoint, there's a really good one at the very end of the whole of the back and forth, and it shows you that the minute he stops getting help, that's the last one on the PowerPoint here. This tells you the story of the whole Desert War. I don't know how readable it is, but you see he's got the good source. He's making all this progress. He loses the good source. He never wins another battle. There's a stalemate, the first Alamein battle, where he's held. And then there's Alam-Halfa, which is another stalemate. And then the famous big Alamein battle in October, November, where he's beaten. And he has, he's lost fellas. He's lost his good source. Now, as I say, there are people that would at this point say, hang on, Phil, that's too simplistic. And of course it is. The British are getting better. We're getting better generals. They bring in Montgomery. We have all this new American kit. And also we've got a much more defendable position because the Alamein front's quite narrow. The Germans are losing on very long supply lines. There's lots of reasons why Rommel loses. And I think I mentioned he had this wonderful intelligence unit of his own, listening in, because the British discipline and communications was lousy, frankly, in 41 and 42. And he's listening into them, and they lose that too. The Australians take them out. It's a very famous story. The Seaboard, he's called, and he's like an elite kind of battlefield intel guy, and he's killed along with most of his men are captured. So there's several reasons why he's in the dark, but I think Fellers is probably the most important. And if you look at that chart, that's a little bit of evidence, I think, for my argument.
Well, the thing is, it's fine margins, and a quote I borrowed from another channel on YouTube, Indian Spartacus, is nothing happens in a vacuum, is it? I mean, even with
Correct.
Cedric last night talking about the French, is that anybody who tries to put down the victory at El Alamein to one single thing, it's kind of naive. His battles are won because of lots of little variables. There's the logistics issue, there's air power, there's intelligence, there's morale, there's the equipment, there's
Absolutely right.
Terrain, tactics, leadership, weather, luck. All those factors are coming in there. But it is clear from that diagram there that after June 42, which is when Rommel, as we said in the clip there, completely loses this intelligence picture he'd been getting, is cut off. Things are changed for him. And I think it's the historian who said he's the goose laying the golden egg. In that situation, if you're getting something that is so fantastic, do we know just how much Rommel, leaned on that? I mean, obviously Rommel has many qualities. There's aerial reconnaissance. There's interrogation of prisoners. There's all other his own intercepts. There's his own intelligence. But is there any idea how much Rommel is putting his faith on this? I mean, you mentioned the Hitler quote there, which is fairly strong, that he is leaning on this a lot.
Well, I don't actually have a quote from Rommel directly. I have some quotes from his own officers saying how important it was, how they lent on it. And there's a really good one actually from basically from July, where they've just lost it. And this was later found after the war in Berlin. And it says, sadly, it seems we will not be able to count on these intercepts for a long time to come, which is very unfortunate, as they have been telling us all we needed to know immediately about virtually every enemy action and plan. That's pretty definitive, isn't it? That's internally in the German, intelligence community. Actually, the funniest thing about all this is Fellers himself. They bring him home. They give him a medal and a promotion. He's never told. He doesn't know about this story ever. He dies not knowing. This story was so secret, and that's partly because it involved Bletchley. And if you remember, the activities of Bletchley and the Ultra program, I think it was the mid 1970s when it was first spoken about. And he himself is never told, and he becomes very important. He becomes MacArthur's right-hand man in Japan. So he's jointly in charge of running an entire recently conquered nation. He becomes a very powerful Republican politician, or a political kind of activist in the 50s. A bit of a right-wing headbanger, if truth be known. But he still never knows how he almost cost the Allies the Mediterranean. So I find it extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. He's the opposite of James Bond. And the irony of James Bond from the movies is that every hotel lobby staff knows who he is. Every barman knows who he is, yet he's a spy. And in Feller's case, he's a spy and agent, but he doesn't know he is.
That's right. That's right.
Other people know he is, but he doesn't know he is himself. It's extraordinary.
I mean, we're used to living at a time where there are very few secrets that are really hard to keep. I guess, don't forget, for quite a long time, every single Ultra decrypt went directly just to Churchill. I mean, after a while, there were so many of them that wasn't possible. But we're talking about Churchill and Roosevelt and maybe the chiefs of staff and Allenbrook, and that's kind of all it needs to know. But the story is a great story about the Desert War and about Rommel. It's also a great story, I think, about the Anglo-American relationship, because certainly Chris Jenner, the academic I've talked about, he really thinks that this very successful kind of Five Eyes partnership, which exists to this day, actually begins that day in Roosevelt's office when he realizes that his own side have been very amateurish. And, the British might not be the best at fighting tank battles, but they're very good at intelligence. And the British intelligence elite really work with the likes of Bill Donovan to form the American intelligence community. I think a lot of American academics would accept this. It's a bit like that. We gave them the recipe for the atom bomb and they made it. We gave them the secrets of breaking Enigma and they took it on to another stage.
Well, it's that 1942 era was rife for collaboration and experimentation and sharing of ideas. The Rangers are an offshoot of the Commandos. Commandos then take the inspiration back from the Rangers. The SOE lend a hand to OSS. So OSS then kind of improve some things for SOE, and everything is this sort of global situation of moving in the same direction for the same reason. And then, of course, post-war, it kind of spits up again a little bit.
No, and it's right. In a sense, Fellows has lots of happy endings in terms of the Anglo-American relationship and the plan, because Churchill's plan was the right plan. If you'd let the Americans have their way, there would have been a massive catastrophe on the beaches of northern France. He was right to advise caution and to do it slowly. And as the Americans found when they finally meet Rommel themselves, Kasserine Pass, it's not that easy. And of course, the relationship of intelligence sharing, which goes on to this day. But the other thing I should say, I suppose, just being a little bit cynical about it, is this suspicion of British motive. That also continues. And that plays out in the arguments about finance and who's going to pay for Britain to kind of rebuild itself and settle its debts after the war. They're very, very keen, perhaps rightly, that we commit to no longer being imperialists, certainly in the case of India. There's always a suspicion that Churchill is going to renege on the Atlantic Charter, which actually promises self-determination. And we're fighting a war. Well, we're fighting a war to stop this terribly evil force in the world, number one. But we're also fighting a war to hang on to the empire. And it becomes rather hard to make that argument when you've committed in writing to self-determination. So that
this whole story is fascinating. It's, as you said, it's an insight into Anglo-American relations. It's an insight into the gradual improving of intel on both sides. And I think it's been a recurring theme on World War II TV. Is often we judge the Allied successes by how good the Allies were by 1945 at most things, but how in 42, 41 they were still learning the game. But because we ended up doing better, and the Bletchley Park story and the Ultra and things like that. I mean, we did a show about the New Zealanders on Crete and how Freiburg there is aware of the German invasion because of Ultra, but doesn't take it that seriously because Ultra didn't have a track record then. Ultra, now we know because people say, oh, well, Ultra shortened the war by 2 years, or whatever these quotes people. But there's a time when it's new. There's a time when it hadn't earned its reputation. This 41, 42 era is everybody really, they're not amateurs, but they're not yet the slick professional teams they would be a few years later.
That's absolutely right. And I think that one of the great themes, certainly of the book, the work I've done, is the growing professionalism of the Allies, especially the British, actually, who become, if you look at the final months of the war, take the 14th Army in Burma. I mean, that's a Commonwealth force. It's a largely Indian force, but it is immaculately managed. The logistics, the communications, the medical support, the propaganda, it's everything meshing together. And it does take time. You look at some of the campaigns in the desert, and the utter shambles. Backbiting generals, lousy communication discipline, really ropey tactics. And just made me think of Peter Vaux again, that wonderful old soldier. He said he always thought the British needed some better code words. Some of the operations were things like Operation Carrots, and Operation Coca-Cola. Imagine if this was the Soviet army, it would be Operation Exterminate the Enemies or Operation Total Vengeance.
And they are modern operations are much more exciting and dynamic. I mean, I always make the joke about Normandy is that the American sector has the cool names: Bloody Gulch, Hell's Corner, Purple Heart Lane, Purple. We have Hill 112. We have we don't seem to have the way of naming things. Anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole.
No, it is a rabbit hole, but it speaks to that kind of the fact that we got tougher and more professional and better organized.
So we have a question from the Great Dominion, and we kind of touched on it, but once the realization that Fellers is the leak, what did Bill Donovan and FDR know about the situation? What was their response?
Well, their response was to change the codes, put it down quick, apologize to Churchill profusely and personally, and to bring Fellers back and give him a medal. And that's what happened. And, perhaps he deserved what he did a very thorough job. A very thorough job of informing Washington and Rommel about what was going on, which actually is what he was being paid to do.
Because in fairness, he didn't do anything wrong, did he? He hadn't. It's not like he had been told to use one method of communication and was using a different one off his own back. He was using the system that was the system. He was providing, as you say, exactly the information he was being asked to find and sending it to exactly who he was meant to be sending it to. It's just the unfortunate fact the Italians were intercepting.
You could fault the Americans for being naive, not changing their codes. It's called the Black Book Code. They've been using it for 5 years, I think. And they still had a peacetime mentality, and it was the diplomatic service as well, not the army. He was using. But the British were at fault for not. There were people in London who said, "Are we sure? Are we sure we should be letting him communicate? Are we sure we should be letting him come to all these meetings?"
It's the perfect, as you said, it's that perfect storm, isn't it? In that when he first went to North Africa, everybody is treading on eggshells is not quite the right expression about him, but they're courting him because they know he's a representative of his country, and the USA can be very influential. So everyone's freely giving him access because he's the right person. But when you were talking about the meetings, and I'm thinking of like when if you're a teacher and the person comes from the head place to sit and watch you teaching your class, and of course everything changes, do you do things differently because the inspector's there? Or like a business advisor coming in, sitting on a meeting, do you conduct it exactly the way you normally do, or do you make a difference because there's someone there inspecting it? I feel that was a situation the British were in 41, 42, is that they know this guy is very important, but as you said, how much do you say in front of him? How much do you admit that things are going wrong?
That's
do you
right.
do you sugarcoat things? Do you hold back?
Well, he's actually at the staff conference. He's actually there where they're looking at the maps and saying, what are we going to do about this brigade? And oh my God, they've got no petrol over here. And I think also the social side. He'd been there so long. He was personally very close to a lot of these people. Like I say, he could travel around with his bottle of whiskey, chat to people. He was very kind of affable bloke. Perfect, really. All spies should be like that. Make people want to tell them things. Even
I mean, and that again, it's the perfect storm, isn't it? He clearly was a sort of person that's not kind. I don't want to mean in uncomplimentary, but kind of a bit beige, a bit kind of the kind of person that everybody not so forceful that he annoys people. Just the kind of person that everybody gets on with everybody, but perhaps not maybe memorable. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I think he could fade into the background a little bit, take notes and remember things. He had a great memory, and just people like to confide in him. That's what Peter said.
And people are saying that if he had found out about it, if he had been told about it either during the war, it would have been mortifying to know.
He would have been mortified.
You were possibly responsible for the end of the North African and Mediterranean campaign.
Many deaths. Many deaths.
Very, very, very unfortunate. So the question I want to bring up now is I mean, you talked about your desire to get this into a better known story. Is why isn't it a better known story? I mean, the first thing I can think of is when we think of North Africa and codes and spies, the Rebecca Code and the German agent. That one is maybe more famous. I've got a couple of books on that one myself. So maybe that has drawn a bit of the limelight. But what's your reason why this story isn't as better known?
That's a really good question. Well, I think it's partly that not a lot of the stories that we still talk about are the stories that we were brought up to talk about. So, in the 60s and 70s, if you're roughly my age, you were raised in a certain atmosphere, and there was lots of D-Day and lots of Alamein and lots of Battle of Britain, of course. And of course, this story didn't really start to come out until the late 70s, when the whole Bletchley Park story fully emerged. I think also there is a certain hero worship still of Rommel.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
He's like the good German, isn't he?
Yeah.
He dies slightly heroically because he supposedly gets involved, at least he seems to have been on the fringe of the plot to get rid of Hitler. And he fights what is seen as a generally clean war. Because there are very civilians to get in the way in the desert, not many of them. And he's not associated with the horrors of the Eastern Front. So maybe that's one of the reasons.
I think I agree with you.
I'm not forceful enough in my pictures, Paul. Maybe that's it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree with you, because it's that when the Bletchley Park information started coming out, 70s and 80s, Rommel was still very much the darling of World War II. That's in the Max Hastings, John Keegan, Carlo d'Este era of celebrating how great the German leaders were, how appalling the British leaders were, and the American leaders. And I think kind of admitting to the world that Rommel was getting some of his assistance from this incredible intelligence, windfall he was getting, would take the shine off the hero worship he was getting now. But now, in an era where Rommel isn't quite so well regarded, it seems more important now to air this story and say that he had this one of several aces. We're not going to say this is the only ace he has. Obviously, he is quite good at mobile warfare. He does have some better equipment. He is good at certain things, but it's definitely it's definitely a bonus he had, and as you say, once it was cut off from him in June 42, the difference is quite outstanding.
Yes, I think that's a really good upsum, actually. And you know, who knows? Perhaps Tom Hanks will return my calls. He'd be a good fellas, don't you think?
Well, I don't think we've got any more questions. But other people are saying that maybe it was embarrassing for the Americans to admit this story in the 70s and 80s. I don't know. That's a possibility as well. But either way, we've got the story out there now.
Thank you.
To wrap things up, where would you like to? Obviously, appearing on World War II TV is the highlight of your professional career today. But beyond that, you know, what would you'd like to see a movie? You'd like to see something about fellas.
Well, actually, I've somewhere in the unsightly piles of books over there that I'm not sure pointing the camera at. There's a sort of a novel proposal. I think you could write a really good fact-based novel on this, because I haven't even got into the sort of personal side.
Yeah,
I mean, the incredible soap opera of the generals and the backstabbing that he finds himself a part of. And I don't know if you're going to mention him much. Chink, Dormer Smith, in your series of programs, he was Auchinleck's kind of favoured general, and everybody else hated him, and he hated everybody else. But he was a incredibly colourful character because he knew fellas, of course. And he's the one that's drafted in to help mastermind the first Battle of Alamein, and then promptly fired. And it's typical of the Desert War generals that he is so disenchanted with Britain, with Churchill and the British Army. Do you know what he does? He goes back to Ireland and he joins the IRA. He becomes a member of the IRA in the 50s. Wow. That's one of many crazy stories from this time.
James Colvin, who is going to be on next week talking about training and tactics and doctrine, what was I'll just read the question out there. Read the Australian elimination of Rommel's wireless intercept unit. When it was reported to him, his reaction was. That's his question for you.
Goodness no, I don't know actually. I mean, I assume it was oh shit in German, because these people have been very important as well. And it was actually, that's at the turning point, isn't it? It's in the first Battle of Alamein where they finally, you know, find a way of stopping them, and the tactics are better. The morale is a little bit better, and certainly the supplies coming in are better. They manage to concentrate their. There's a great line from Rommel, actually, I do remember. It's in the book somewhere. Oh, here it is. This is when he's talking about the battle at Gazala. Because Rommel is outnumbered consistently by the British and keeps beating them. And he says, "What is the use of my enemy having overall superiority if one allows a formation to be smashed piece by piece, and he never concentrates superior strength at the decisive point," which is what the generals were doing in early 42. And finally, when it comes to Alamein 1 and Alamein 2, they do start to concentrate forces at the decisive point. So that's.
Well, I mean, so your point there about Alamein is well made, and I was going to ask you the kind of final question I'm going to ask is to everybody who's going to be on over these 2 weeks is kind of about the historiography of El Alamein. In your own, you know, you've written about it, you've like myself, you've read about it for 20, 30, 40 years. What's your summing up of the El Alamein campaign or the autumn of 42? Do we talk about it too much? Do we talk about it not enough? Are we focusing on the wrong things, the right things? Give me a kind of a summary of where you are and your understanding of the El Alamein campaign.
Oh, I think it's transformational because don't forget, it's before Stalingrad. It's the first big victory on land. And it's possibly the last great purely British and Commonwealth victory. Perhaps ever. Well, no, the 14th Army in Burma. But it's so important to morale. You know, the church bells are rung for the first time since the beginning of the war. People have become very defeatist. People had thought that the Germans were supermen. It had been a long slog to autumn 42 of lots of defeats, lots of humiliations, lots of sunken ships. And it just didn't seem that whatever we did would work. And there was a, you know, like I say, Churchill himself is rocking. We don't have much respect from the Americans, frankly, as fighters, which is a bit harsh because the Americans themselves haven't fought the Nazis. And when they do, they realize how difficult it is. We don't have much respect from Stalin. I think it transformed Britain's standing amongst its allies and the morale of its people.
No, that's how I think. I mean, I think the debate's going to be over 2 weeks is whether or not it was really necessary to second the battle, given that the landings in North Africa are going to be taking place imminently. But I think if for no other reason, as you say there, for the morale of the people back home, and having written about the Battle of Britain is as much a battle for the public perception and belief in the victory as it is what the airmen are doing in the skies. It's both, isn't it? But for the people of all across the British Isles and across the empire, the end of the Battle of Britain brought about a new, renewed hope, a renewed belief, a confidence. El Alamein, regardless of whether or not the military campaign was entirely necessary, because people can argue about how it could have been fought. For the people back home, that imagery that was coming out there, the pathé and the newsreels and was of we have kicked Rommel's ass, and the world needed that. I think they
absolutely
needed that.
It did. But burst a bubble. It burst a bubble.
Well, then things there. So Phil, it's been great talking to you. So
great pleasure. And I look forward to doing it again if you'll have me back.
Well, I will see everybody again tomorrow with John Parshall for his American views of the Battle of Alamein. But it's been Paul with me saying good evening for tonight, and thank you, Phil, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is World War II TV. Switching off. Bye.
Cheers, mate. Bye.